Good morning, everyone. Bonjour, bienvenue à l'OCDE. It's a pleasure to have you here. I'm Marcus Monturi. I'm the Director for Public Governance here at the OECD. It's really a pleasure to open the session on blockchain field GovTech and to discuss the developments in the government's use of blockchain technology. I will say a few words of introduction and then give the floor to the able moderator, then Chenok, and of course I'll introduce the panel as I do that. So sorry. Do you need to start over or okay, good. So again, a pleasure to be here with you. Let me just perhaps give you a bit of our point of view from the public governance side on how we see really the challenges and the ways the governments around the world are approaching the use of blockchain technology. We manage here both on the public governance side, but also the regulatory side in my side of the house here. I think what's very, very clear to us is that blockchain can yield major benefits, and just to cite a few, in terms of increased transparency, accountability, security, and even the ability to automate some of the public sectors to make them more accessible and more efficient. We have recently identified over 200 initiatives, blockchain initiatives, across more than 40 governments around the world, not only national governments, of course, but around different jurisdictions around the world, perhaps is the best word. And they range from issues like combating illicit trade and human trafficking, but also issues on combating fraud and corruption in public procurement. And there are a number, of course, the use of blockchains in a variety of public services. I want to give you just some examples so you understand the breadth of the use of blockchain technology in the public sector. A very interesting example in Mongolia, where there's an estimated 40% of all medicines and drugs on sale are fake. Of course, you can imagine the complications, the health, the death, even death problems. And the government in Mongolia has partnered with the private sector to use blockchain to track each single batch of medicine along the supply chain. And this is, of course, very new, and we are very much looking forward to the results of this initiative, and of course we'll report back as soon as we can on the results of this initiative. Another example, Italy, who is actually using blockchain to digitalize the processes of awarding and tracking academic credentials and academic certificates, and greatly reducing, of course, the risk of fraud. Now, an example from local government, Austin, Texas, in the USA, is now piloting a blockchain-based initiative to help homeless residents access public services. I mean, very interesting experience that we'll also look forward to report on as soon as we can. And finally, a company in Ghana that is partnering with the governments to build digital blockchain land registries. So for the very first time in Ghana, providing a systematic and reliable tracking of who owns what. And of course, I don't need to convince you of the importance of have a reliable land registry anywhere in the world. But what those initiatives show is that, again, governments at very different levels, from national to regional to local, they are recognizing the potential of blockchains. But if I were to be candid, I would say that this is still very experimental. And if I may even puncture the balloon of excessive optimism that sometimes we hear, there are lots of challenges, and we have already detected and started working on those challenges. And perhaps I'll spend a little bit of time describing some of the challenges that we are observing in ensuring that the public sector can indeed adopt those new technologies. The obvious ones is the technical and I'll say the practical challenges, such as the lack of common standards and the interoperability between the different IT systems. It's a problem that has, of course, existed for a long time. There are very, very clear and serious resource and capacity challenges in the public sector related sometimes to skills across the public administrations, and I would say inadequate level of investment in funding in I would say the early experimentation phase of the use of blockchains. There are legal and cultural challenges such as regulatory gaps and even some, I would say, insufficient political and institutional buy-in in some administrations. This, I would say, is on top of the usual risk aversion which is very typical of the public sector for those of you who come from the public sector or are dealing with the public sector. And finally, issues related to privacy, to security, to ethics. There are different considerations there, and sometimes they present very difficult trade-offs for the adoption of the new technologies in the public sector. So for blockchain to succeed, we do need to address these challenges. And for that, we need, again, room for experimentation. We need the resources, and we need better cooperation across jurisdiction on common approaches. Let me say, perhaps use this as an opportunity to say the type of work that we're doing here at the OECD on those issues. The OECD Public Governance Directorate is working with governments and of course, partners in industry, civil society, to help them to generate knowledge about how to address these challenges. And I want to specifically commend the work of the Observatory of Public Sector Innovation, the OPSI. Some of you are familiar with the OPSI, who is really now holding a consultation, a public consultation, on a draft primer on artificial intelligence and the use and implications for the public sector. So again, this is a type of consultations, and we hope that you help us as we develop knowledge in this area. We'll be publishing in a couple of months a paper on what we call the state of the art in the use of emerging technologies in the public sector, and the emphasis will be on blockchains and artificial intelligence. And this is like something that is coordinated by the OECD, but there are many authors from different walks of life. So I think some of you are actually sitting in this table, if I understand, actually participating in the drafting of this report. So thank you so much. Then, of course, this on the public governance side, but then on the regulatory side. And perhaps that's also one work that is very promising and very badly needed, I would say. The Regulatory Policy Committee is looking at ways to adapt regulatory processes in response to blockchain and other innovation. And what that means in practice is perhaps more actively engaging, I would say, a broader and more diverse range of stakeholders in the regulatory process, investing in foresight and horizon scanning, initiating regulatory impact assessments much earlier in the policy-making process, and carrying out regular post-implementation reviews. The pace of technology is such that we need to invest a lot on this post-implementation and take action very often based on those reviews. The regulatory communities are also looking a lot of international regulatory cooperation. And it's obvious that in these type of technologies, this is essential to avoid arbitrage, to protect consumer rights, to address cyber threats, and promote interoperability across the different regulatory frameworks and of course, related to enforcement. Regulatory policy is also important to create a favorable environment to the digital economy. So in a nutshell, if I am to conclude, it's clear that blockchain and other emerging technologies are evolving very rapidly. What I hope, we hope really that this session will help, along with all the reports that are coming, will help uncover the latest insights from you, blockchain experts, both in public and private sectors and in civil society. And we'll be very much looking forward to hearing your insights and your thoughts on how to overcome those barriers and address those challenges that I referred to, and ideas that you have on how can we best advise governments here at the OECD to make better use of these technologies. So we hope, again, the discussions today will inform the work we're doing here, and we thank you in advance for your very candid, hopefully very, very candid assessment of the challenges ahead. So I'll conclude here, and I'll pass the floor to Dan Chenok, who will moderate the session. Dan is a good friend of the OECD, has been for a long time, and he's the Executive Director for the IBM Center for the Business of Government. He oversees all the center's activities in connecting research to practice to benefit government, and of course he has written and spoken extensively around government technology, cybersecurity, privacy, regulation, budget, acquisition, and presidential transitions. So again, very able moderator to help guide the discussion in this session. We also, again, have the pleasure to have Isabelles Corbet, who is the head of regulatory affairs in GovTech at R3. In her role, she meets with regulators, central banks, and policymakers around the world, helping the public sector understand blockchain, address policy questions related to it, and shape their blockchain strategies. So again, thank you very much for being with us. Looking forward to hearing your insights. We have Elliott Donata, who is working as the Human Environment and Transport Inspectorate of the Netherlands. And of course, the work consists of monitoring and encouraging compliance with both national and European legislation and regulations in favor of a safe and sustainable human environment, safe and sustainable transport, and maintaining confidence in housing associations. So again, excellent to have you here, Elliott, from the public sector perspective. Very much looking forward to hearing from you. And last but not least, Ángel Martín Bautista, who is working in the General Secretariat for Digital Administration in Spain. He is the Spanish representative in the European Blockchain Partnership, and both in the policy and the technical groups, and also working here with us at the OECD in one of the thematic groups on the use of emerging technologies. Again, very, very lucky to have all of you with us. Dan, the floor is yours. Looking forward to the session.
Well, thank you very much, Marcos, and it is indeed a pleasure and an honor to be here at the summit with all of you, with our distinguished panel, who we'll hear from momentarily. As you noted, I've had an association with OECD and spent time here a couple of decades ago on staff for a period of time, so it's always a real honor to come back and meet with you all here. As Marcos mentioned, I run the Center for the Business of Government. We are essentially a think tank inside of the IBM Corporation. We work with academic experts and leaders who do research on topics of interest to government leaders in the US and around the world. And these can range from technology. We wrote a report last year on blockchain by an MIT professor named Thomas Harjono around blockchain in government, which I'll talk about momentarily, to public-private partnerships, to procurement, to risk management. So we have a wide research agenda. All of our information is public domain and available on our website at businessofgovernment.org. We have done some extensive research around blockchain. I'll just reflect on that momentarily, and then we'll hear from our distinguished panel. First, as you noted, we are in early days. We are addressing challenges we see in governments around the world. But the interesting thing is you talked about 200 or so blockchain initiatives in the public sector that you've cataloged. And we've done similar research and found that they really range across the various different segments of the public sector. They range from defense and intelligence to using blockchain to increase the efficiency of military and defense information sharing, to public safety, increasing the ability of public safety officers to understand travel patterns and to analyze criminal behavior, to tax and revenue management in terms of customs and border information, even to social services delivery. We see blockchain initiatives in that space. So you're seeing digital reinvention across many of the elements of government. Second point is that these elements are not only involving the public sector. As most people in this room know, a blockchain network is really only as good as its partners across sectors. And so we're seeing that a lot of these implementations involve businesses who are in the business network, citizens, and that there are multiple stakeholders, often at least a half dozen, if not dozens of stakeholders or even hundreds within a blockchain network. And here we're talking primarily about permissioned blockchain networks, which we'll talk about in a moment as well. In our report last year that I mentioned, we looked more deeply at identity management and payment security and supply chain management, and how blockchain can help enable security in all of those areas, enable visibility and accuracy for governments around the world. One of the things we found is that government leaders need to be deeply involved. This is not necessarily a technology issue. Of course, it is at its root, but in order to be successful and sustained across organizations, leaders need to focus and have a vision of how to make blockchain work for their missions and programs in their bureaus that will be successful. That it is about collaboration between government and industry, again, to be successful. And that, as you say, experimentation is necessary. We need research and test beds to understand the nature of blockchain experiments and to scale and sustain them in the public sector. Some of the principles that we've found that are successful in terms that to increase the chances of success for blockchain implementations, not just in government, but around the world, are openness, the ability of the networks to share, to use open source platforms to innovate, that permission networks are not necessarily private, that permission networks need governance procedures to be able to bring in partners and expand their applicability. To that end, blockchain governance is really a team sport. It involves multiple players and multiple nodes who can come together and develop common standards to be able to share, back to one of Marcus's point, and enable interoperability. And then finally, we're all concerned, of course, about privacy and compliance with regulatory regimes around the world, and building that understanding into the blockchain fabric as these applications are developed is important. We've seen a couple of early examples of governments working with the private sector, one that's probably familiar to many in this room, the TradeLens platform, which is a customs platform. About 50% of the world's ocean-going traffic has information that sits on that platform that is shared by many, many customs enterprises around the world, accessible by government. It's got about 2 million transactions a day across the fabric today. And we're seeing governments at the whole of government level start to move in this direction. Dubai being a global leader in this with their Blockchain 2020 strategy to enable transactions across the whole of government. So I really look forward to hearing the perspectives of our very distinguished panel. And I'm going to ask a series of questions to them, and then the floor will be yours for questions and observations as well, and we'll have you out of here for lunch. So if I could start, Isabel. Tell us about sort of your role at R3 and your general perspectives on the topic of blockchain in government, and then we'll kind of go around the horn.
Sure, and thank you for having me. It is a privilege to be here speaking to you today. So by way of background, and I have to disclose, I'm a derivatives lawyer, so I am risk averse. I am probably as conservative as they get. And I never really thought that blockchain was something that I would be interested in or would have as big of a role as it does today. But I came to R3 3.5 years ago, really because it was too good of an opportunity to come to a company that I thought would change the world. And I still think that we as a company and this technology as a whole will do that. We have made a lot of major strides over the past years as an industry. And I think that the rest of this year and next year will continue to see substantial innovation. So R3 as a company started kind of with roots in financial services. And importantly, what I mean by that is highly regulated environments. So we started out as a consortium of banks, which is something that we have grown far past since we opened beyond that in early 2016. But that really points out what is on our mind when we are developing technology. And that is, how do we foster responsible innovation? How do we produce a platform that facilitates regulatory compliance? And how do we bring this technology that has historically been associated with kind of anonymous disintermediation, kind of the Wild West, right, of data and of assets moving. How do we take the good parts of that and make it useful to banks and to businesses? So we built our platform called Corda, which is a permission network, so you know who you're transacting with. It also has limited data sharing, so privacy is fundamental to the platform that we've designed. And that privacy and identity kind of go hand in hand. So if you know who you're transacting with, you can actually limit the amount of data that's shared around the network. and I won't bore you with a lot more detail about what that means, but I provide those pieces to highlight what's unique about Corda. And where Corda fits in the ecosystem is we are a platform company. So when I say we've built a blockchain, what I mean is we have built kind of the base layer platform. And this is something that's kind of hard to pick apart as people talk about technology of where they fit. So just for context, there are the blockchain platforms down here. So you just heard Dan mention Fabric, there is Ethereum, there's our platform Corda, and many more at that platform layer. And then on top of those platforms are the apps. So the apps that are being built that sit on top of these platforms are the things that actually do the moving of the assets and the data. So when someone talks about what we were just hearing about the diamond tracking, that's an app that is tracking diamonds that sits on top of a blockchain platform. That's just a note kind of on how the ecosystem works. Our platform, Corda, because of its unique design, we have seen a lot of uptake beyond financial services, so particularly in insurance. There are a couple of commercially live applications today in insurance. We're doing a lot in healthcare, oil and gas, tracking things like gold as well. Telco, I just came from a telco conference earlier this week in Budapest, which was huge, and blockchain was high on the agenda there. And MasterCard actually just announced yesterday that they are building a cross-border payments application on our platform, Corda. So that just gives you an idea of what's happening and where we are and where we're seeing uptake. As Dan said, I head up regulatory affairs, so I have been over my 3.5 years to about 30 countries speaking with regulators, all kinds of regulators, answering questions from a policy perspective. And the reason that it now says on my title that I head up GovTech is that for the reason that we're in this room, we are seeing a lot of interest from governments in actually using the technology. So those conversations have gone from purely policy to, if this technology is so great, how can it make my life better? How can it make my job more efficient, more reliable, faster? All of those things that you hear spoken about in the private sector. So I am doing both policy as well as kind of practice, if you will. And we're seeing governments building on Corda globally. I won't get into those details right now because I think that we'll kind of go through those in our conversation, but that gives you an overview of who I am and what R3 is doing.
Thank you, Isabel. Angel, take us to the government side. You work for an ICT ministry. Talk to us. You work for an ICT ministry. Talk to us a little bit about your perspective.
Hello, good morning, gentlemen. I really appreciate the opportunity to address this Congress. First of all, I apologize that Fernando de Pablo couldn't attend this Congress today. We have an intense week in Spain, you know, where maybe it's going to start a new government, so Fernando has to stay there. I'm honored, anyway, to come in his place. Yes, I work in General Secretary for the Digital Administration. That's the public organization that is in charge of the digital transformation in the central administration. We participate in national and international blockchain forums. For instance, we are very active in the European Blockchain Partnership, where every European country is working very hard to build the European blockchain services infrastructure. There are many use cases in there, and I am the Spanish representative in both of them, the technical one and the policy one. Maybe the most important because they have to coordinate all information that comes from the other use cases. I'm also the Spanish representative here at the OECD in the thematic group about artificial intelligence and blockchain. In addition, I am one of the coordinators of 2 work groups that we built in Spain about blockchain. One of them is called the Emerge, about emerging technologies and, of course, blockchain. It's composed by all Spanish ministries and public organizations in order to coordinate all information about blockchain and activities, and also in artificial intelligence, for instance. And the other work group we create is called Blockchain, and is formed by people who is participating in the European blockchain service infrastructure in order to coordinate our activities in Europe.
Thank you, Angel. So, Elliott, you come from the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management, so you're a user, a customer of the tech side. Talk about it from the programmatic perspective.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity to share my experiences with you. And I'm sure I will learn a lot about you guys. So, we have got some great challenges within the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management. It's about like smart mobility, climate adaptation, but also the circular economy, reducing waste. So we are looking into ways to use new technologies, emerging technologies, to solve these problems. So about 3 years ago, we started with some pilots. Our directors decided to start with a blockchain pilots in order to learn and build some knowledge about these new technologies. It's not our core business. Innovation is not our core business, but we sure knew that these new technologies would help us to solve some of these challenges we are facing as a government, but also as a society. So what we've done is, begin with POC, proof of concepts, building prototypes, and looking into, building some experience with a blockchain. We did some pilots with supply chain, the tracking of waste. We did some pilots with registry of, the driving and resting time of lorry drivers, truck drivers, but also did some asset management where light poles would give a procurement order in order to be repaired, so without, human interference. So we did some paper POCs, and also we are also conducting some field labs on supply chain together with Belgium, also Port of Rotterdam, and other governments in order to see how we can implement blockchain. But we also saw that there were some issues that we couldn't solve. Blockchain is not only about technology, it's about cooperation. And these issues we try to solve together with other governments. So we started with the Dutch Blockchain Coalition. We are one of the founding partners of the Dutch Blockchain Coalition. And the aim of the coalition is to, foster or stimulate the ecosystem, but also creating a reliable infrastructure for the blockchain. And then again, we won't be creating it ourselves as a government. It's about stimulating the creation of a reliable ecosystem and infrastructure. And then it became, actually we were looking into cooperating on a European basis, because a blockchain within the Netherlands doesn't make sense. I mean, we are an open economy within an international world, globalization. So we thought, okay, if we want to have a reliable blockchain, it should be at least on a European level. So we're joining also with the European Commission together with Spain and other member states on EPSI, on European blockchain services infrastructure, and also developing some blockchain initiatives, blockchain apps. Well, that's my introduction right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elliott. And so let's go to our first question. All of our speakers have talked about it being early days. We are in an experimental phase. We're looking to see, how can government create conditions for success in terms of scale? So to any of the panel, what do you see as one or two key success factors for governments to look for in terms of taking things from the pilot stage and moving into a scale stage?
Yeah, it's actually also creating awareness. We're also, conducting some pilots, and we see that we, in terms of education, in terms of like people, companies and governments don't know what the implications are from implementing blockchain. So that's one side of the problem we're trying to solve. But also actually regulations. We see ourselves as one of the launching customers of a blockchain. So we are not necessarily the ones who would be building a blockchain infrastructure in terms of long term. But at the first stage, I think it's important for governments to invest and to be, well, the first launching customer. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well, from a public sector perspective, we think that decentralized ledger technologies are at a very emerging stage. Although, as I mentioned, the General Secretary for Digital Administration is on track. We are participating very actively in the EBP, and several Spanish administrations are working in projects related with blockchain. For instance, Governor of Aragon has a public procurement project using that network, the Diploma Blue, formed by the Spanish universities to exchange diploma between them. Sport in Valencia to track containers in the ports, and for instance, Catalonia with EOCAT, a production solar energy blockchain solution. Our experience with blockchain teaches that it presents some challenge, as you point, Marcos. First of all, its inherent complexity. Sometimes it's very difficult to understand that technology. Public administration need to use permissioned networks, and that model is very new. So it's difficult to find use cases that fits into that model. Normally, it's sweet to solve problems that have a decentralized dimension. So then arise the term collaboration and governance. And you know, sometimes agreements between all parties tends to be difficult to achieve. There are some pending issues to clarify, as interoperability and legal and regulatory frameworks. And of course, and often happens with disruptive technologies, there is a resistance to change, you know. But therefore, from my point of view, main of the ingredients to succeed would be training and education. In Spain, we are starting some initiatives in this matter in order to give skills to civil servants in this area. Collaboration and agreement, of course. And finally, an awareness that blockchain will not substitute all the efficient centralized models that we are using today, but in some cases it will. We have to be able to recognize those cases, those use cases.
Yeah, I agree with what you just said, and I think that your point about making sure that you have a problem that you want solved, that blockchain is in fact a good solution to that problem, and then choosing the right blockchain to build that solution on, those are the building blocks of creating an effective solution that makes sense. But also, we need to see success in order for there to be continued innovation and resources put on blockchain. So if you are trying to build a solution to a problem that doesn't exist, you're really just going to be wasting your time and money doing that. So that careful vetting, making sure that you're pursuing solutions that are worthwhile and that will actually benefit you, your government, your country, is absolutely cornerstone. So in addition to that, you have then the various considerations and the various elements of solutions, which are you need the technology, you need the business, and you need the regulatory points addressed. So the solution has to work in all of those three ways. And I think today you see a lot of solutions that work in only one or two of them. That regulatory piece is obviously a very important component, and truth be told, I think I would say that the technology itself may be the easiest of those three, which is hard for a lot of people to believe. The other thing I would say is when you see the use cases that are getting the most substantial uptake in the public sector, there are globally pursued use cases, and I think that's for one main reason, which is these are use cases that have a lot of potential upside. They are also easily understood, and they are generally, they affect individuals, right? So from a political perspective, if the citizens can understand what this technology is used for and how it will make their lives easier, that is a solution that they will support continued resourcing for. For example, land registries, car registries. If anyone here has bought property, has bought real estate in any jurisdiction and had an easy time, please raise your hand. I haven't met anyone yet around the world who can say that. And things like supply chain, knowing that if there is a disease in an animal, that it can be contained when it gets into your food. How do we know where it went? Well, you could use blockchain. Same thing with medication. That's a great example. Those are things that resonate with individuals. And so I think that those things are what really will continue to see traction in the public sector first.
Thank you. Great insights. And I would add tracking the coffee from the farm to the ship to the store to our table.
Cheers.
Second question, blockchain, as we know, sort of sits in a continuum of technologies that governments and private sector organizations are dealing with in terms of sort of movement and maturity. And some people are seeing, if we're trying to apply blockchain to a problem that it's not appropriate for, there's maybe a bit of a backlash. How do you see blockchain fitting into this sort of technology continuum in terms of basic digitalization of e-services to development of cloud-based networks to emerging technologies like blockchain and AI? How do you see that continuum working? Angel, if I could start, since you work at a digital administration, how do you see this technology continuum proceeding for governments?
Yes, there are many isolated proof of concepts using blockchain. And yet, sometimes blockchain is not the answer to solve local and isolated problems. We think that could be a solution in cross-border context or inter-administrative context, where it's more difficult and expensive to use a centralized solution. Blockchain is a very promising technology. Some of its main features sounds very well to administration, such as transparency, traceability, GDPR compliant, security, collaboration on non-intermediaries, and so on. All of them sound very attractive in terms of public administration. But from a public service perspective, we have to look very carefully at use cases that are truly suited for that technology. We have to prioritize caution and prudent thinking in regard to citizens and service first. We cannot immerse in emerging technologies until they have proved the benefit of substituting a service based on a centralized model for a decentralized-led technology model. At the same time, public administration has to explore and to be aware about new technologies that could improve the quality of the services we offer to citizens. That's why we are participating in a very active way in the European Blockchain Partnership, where, for instance, there is a proof of concept or a use case. It's called the Self-Sovereign Identity Framework that we think that is going to contain all information about citizens. But again, this is a very difficult project to understand, because it's very difficult to understand the difference between identity and identification, again. Another example about what I said before. And of course, as an administration, we have to improve and adapt our processes what society demands. But again, we are obliged to apply a principle of prudence, so we have both to explore the new and to ensure the old. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Angel. Elliott, from a user's perspective, how are you seeing this technology continuum play out in the ministry?
Well, first of all, let me react also on the land registry remark of Isabelle. Well, that's one of the issues we are also facing in the Netherlands. because we are a high trust and highly organized country. Most of these services are trusted by our citizens. So we are having a hard time explaining why we should implement the blockchain, because the citizens are fairly happy with some government services. Not all, but some, like land registry. So that's an issue with us. So we're having like the existing IT systems that are working fairly well, and we have to justify investment in new technologies like the blockchain. So that's pretty difficult, but what we have seen is cross-border examples like supply chain, where we have multiple administrations, multiple databases, where we try to position the blockchain as the backbone between these IT systems, between these databases, in order to create trust between the different parties. So that's where we are seeing this heading to. But like I said, it's very difficult to convince people to invest in new technology like this.
That's an interesting point, and I certainly hear that message if you're using trust as the barometer. But I would actually suggest that it's not a measure of whether the services are trusted or not trusted by citizens, but rather is the process efficient for them. So when you take the land example, it's not simply the database function that we're talking about as the registry, which in some places is actually quite central and efficient because it is kept just as a database. But it's leading up to that moment of transaction. So it's not that the record is not to be trusted, it's that when I go to buy a house, I have my mortgage lender, and the person who's selling it has their mortgage lender, and then you have the surveyors and the conveyancers and all of these different parties, and whomever is maintaining the block and lot maps, right? So when you add all of that complexity, it just takes time. So even if I know reliably that the record reflects that I own my house and that I can sell it to Dan, it's the process of how do you get to that record, how do you get the appropriate certifications that the property is what you say it is and the survey is still true and there are no encumbrances, those things. And so if you use the technology to solve for inefficiencies, I think that that's the better way to measure it, but I still entirely take your point that there has to be appetite to improve that.
I think it's a both-and scenario. We need both trust and greater efficiency in terms of government. In order to implement that, of course, government works in an ecosystem. We've heard several of our speakers talk about this, where government's working with industry in different ways. And Isabel, if I could start with you, what do you see as important in your work with companies and now your emerging work with governments in terms of building a network of collaboration across sectors in terms of blockchain?
It's interesting. I've never seen such a collaborative environment as blockchain, especially when you're talking about a technology that is, for the most part, open source. And open source means that anyone can download it, use it, build on it. You could try to sell it, but it's hard to sell something that's available for free. But it creates this whole community development. And so we started out as a consortium, so you could say that kind of our specialty is actually bringing together businesses and partners and regulators. That's absolutely fundamental, and particularly when you're talking about the public sector, it's already been mentioned at least twice, the importance of collaboration across governments. For this to be a global technology and globally deployed, there needs to be kind of global agreement, whether that is standards, regulation, tax, et cetera. All those are very important points. In terms of what this means to develop as in a collaborative environment, this is a technology that's about network effect. So it is not a technology that is useful if I, Isabel, go home and I just download Corda and put up my own node and I'm there by myself. That's not going to get me anywhere. So when you're trying to get network effect, what that means is you need collaboration, you need people to come together and be developing on the same platform or on the same app. And there won't be one platform for all. There will absolutely be multiple platforms that you'll see get significant traction. But each application, each use case, each product needs the input of the relevant people who are really ultimately the users. So at R3, we now have an ecosystem of 300 partners who are building on our platform. We don't build top-of-stack apps, our partners do. We also have 45 investors, we have 30 regulators who are members, plus the customers or the users of Corda, which we can't actually track because it's open source, so we may have no idea who's out there using it. But that gives you a sense of the size of the ecosystem that I think you really need to get this technology moving and fully deployed.
Yeah, it's interesting as we see open networks and multi-hybrid cloud evolving as an industry best practice. We're seeing it evolve in the blockchain scenario as well. Elliott, do you work with industry partners in your work, and what creates conditions for success?
Well, it's interesting because, well, in the Netherlands we are used to cooperation with other parties, you know, triple helix with knowledge, the knowledge sector, private sector. So we're used to that, but we are not used to cooperate with these sectors on IT. We are used to build our own silo applications and roll it out together with maybe other governments, but not with other industry partners. So it's a paradigm shift for us. And, well, we are building some apps together with like Port of Rotterdam, but also the Belgian authorities. We're working together with University of Delft. And what we saw was that on the functionality side, there are also aspects that are interesting because we work with certificates within the government, and it's also used in a certificate use case from Europe. So we are also working together with them because they're using certificates for people, for education, but it's also interesting to apply at our use case for goods, because goods need to be accompanied by certificates. So you see actually gradually an ecosystem developing from the government to other sectors. And well, we are cooperating fairly well with other sectors, so I like that.
Thank you. And Angel, from your perspective?
Well done. I think you said the magic words in your question: partnership and collaboration. That has nothing to do with technology, but with people, and to reach outside technology. Sometimes arises a big discussion regarding a use case because stakeholders take advantage of using blockchain to define concepts and projects in the way they are looking for. From my experience, I would recommend start from standards, agreements we reached in the past, so we could move faster to the blockchain model and not being discussing again and again what is, for instance, a diploma. Normally it's difficult of engaging with the private sector. Administration has an obligation to citizens. It should ensure the control on access to citizens' data, and safe governance and consensus systems need to be agreed. We are aware that in many blockchain projects, collaboration between the public and the private sector will be necessary. There will be projects where both sectors will have to collaborate by writing information in the same blockchain network. And that's something we are currently working out right now.
Thank you, Angel. And I'm going to ask one more question to the panel, and then the floor will be yours for questions for most of the balance of the time before we close. So be thinking of your questions. So last question before we open it up. There are many government leaders and practitioners in the room. If you had one piece of advice to say to them to get started, what might that be? Elliott?
Just start. I mean, well, it's, we took a very pragmatic approach, and we learned a lot about that. We just started with field labs, but
in addition to cooperation, which is certainly important, I would say use the resources that you have. I certainly know that it is always a resource question when you're talking about the government doing something, and especially when you say kind of doing something extra. Blockchain has been the extra for a lot of people for a long time, and we're just now really starting to see resources that are actually devoted to blockchain, and that's true in the public and the private sector. So even if you do have a team, I know that that's probably still never going to be as large as you'd like it to be, and companies like R3 and others are here to help you on that journey to explore what blockchain is, what can it be used for. One note on that I think is absolutely crucial to understand is that it is not in our interest as a company or as a member of the blockchain industry to give bad advice, right? We will tell you if blockchain is a good solution to your problem. We will tell you if Corda is a good blockchain for you to choose for that particular use case. It is in everyone's interest for this technology to develop and see significant uptake, that it be well received and we get some wins, and that means building the right product and solving a problem that needs to be solved the right way.
And we certainly share that perspective, so it's an important point to make. Angel, any other thoughts around how to get started?
Well, maybe what makes sense in blockchain from a public administration view is to extend projects to exchange information with others in a decentralized model, and not to use blockchain in a centralized service that is actually running and working.
All right, so we're going to open the floor for Q&A. If you would just identify yourself and your organization, and just raise your hand. We don't have 10 cards, just wave, make sure I see you, and then I'll just kind of point to you for a question. So who would like to take the first question? Way in the back.
Thank you. I'm Nuno. I'm from Accenture, Portugal. My question is about, as the blockchain technology is kind of expensive, as is an emerging technology, and usually government and public projects are very price-driven, what's the best way for private companies to tackle this challenge of cooperating on projects that are expensive, but usually sorry, got lost. I was saying, basically, how should companies tackle this kind of difficulties of the price-driven constraints from public projects?
So the cost and the attention in government, how should companies best work with government? So Isabel, can I start with you on that question?
Yeah, sure. So when it comes to cost of implementing a solution, there are a lot of dynamics to consider. So as I said, Corda is open source. We also have an enterprise version, and nodes using each can interact. So you can have a network where some of the nodes are open source and some are using enterprise, because the enterprise features are what I would say is non-technical. So things like support and firewall configuration and database interaction. But so you take that software cost, and if you call it zero and say that's open source, there are also the providers that you may already have relationships with. So if you're going to deploy in the cloud, you're going to need a cloud provider. You probably already have one. Now, how they're going to price that deployment probably depends on a contract that you already have. The other piece is who's going to do the integration. So you could use a systems integrator who you already have a contract with, and they should be providing you government rates. Certainly if you go with an enterprise solution, an enterprise blockchain, you could also get government rates. But ultimately, this is not like Microsoft Office. You don't just download it and start using Excel that day. Also, as time goes on, I think you will see costs go down significantly, because we will get as an industry, better at building and deploying more efficiently. But for now, I think it would be mostly software costs and also systems integrators and cloud.
Well, we had the same concern. As a government, we were concerned in, well, burning too much money in innovation without success. And blockchain, it's not a silo IT project. Blockchain you develop within a network. So we shared the cost with our other partners. So there were several partners that were willing to share in the cost, but also providing services in kind, like servers, nodes, etc., etc. So the key is to cooperate within the network and sharing costs.
Well, from a public service perspective, of course, you have to make a cost-benefit analysis to determine if blockchain is a good solution. But benefit for citizens is what we have to be in our business. So again, blockchain makes sense from our point of view in some collaborative projects. Normally, it's difficult that blockchain improves what an isolated institution has been doing by itself. So our recommendation is do not use blockchain in a centralized service that it is actually running and working. What makes sense, again, in blockchain is to extend projects, to exchange information with others, are decentralized, so citizens will increase their quality services levels.
Yeah, and I would add that it's to some extent our responsibility in industry to take lessons learned from our implementations and to share those lessons with government to help understand how do you get started, how do you work in increments to build applications over time, and to establish this sort of shared risk, shared cost paradigm, because as the cost curve grows, there's an allocation of risk in terms of delivery of service, so drawing contracts that allocate that risk appropriately in addition to sharing the cost, I think is an important consideration. Next question, anywhere in the room? I know you want to get to lunch. So anybody? Otherwise, back over here. Oh, great, thank you. Back corner.
David Deputy from Vertex, or tax software company. The question I have is, how important is it to educate regulators around encoding the regulations in a way that these technologies can understand them? I'm tempted to say smart contracts, but I'm not going to go there. How important is that shift from the analog written world of policy formulation to one that becomes digital and executable on-chain?
Well, from my point of view, regulation is an agreement, and that's the most difficult thing. When you have the agreement, the standard is more easy to move faster to a blockchain model. So, from my point of view, the most important thing.
Well, I also work at a regulator at the ministry, so we are having talks about how do you codify regulation, not only for blockchain, but just to automate, digitalize, these processes. So we are having talks. We know it's very important, but some regulations aren't apt to digitalize, to codify. So, but we are having talks for new regulations, how we can make it in some ways that you could build, easily build smart contracts.
And I think that that's exactly the right point, which is same way as in smart contracts. People think that a smart contract means that the entire thing has to be automatically executing, and the reality is that that's not. I don't think that's where we will be in the next few years, because contracts have things like arbitration clauses. And as much as we like to think that everything can be automated, really that arbitration will still be off ledger. Same thing applies with regulation. If you have, let's say, position limits or thresholds for reporting, those things can certainly be automated. But when you have things like a subjective test, those things cannot be automated for obvious reasons. So as regulation moves towards, what you just said, Elliot, towards a regulation that's structured in a way that can actually be codified, we'll still be in this world where some of it can be automated and some will continue to be off ledger and manual.
In a past life, when I was in the U.S. government, I was in our Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, and that was well before anybody had heard of the term blockchain. But I think that one of the best practices from a regulator's perspective is don't think of it as regulation writ large, think of it as a rule, perhaps a proceeding that we can implement the technology in that fits a use case, as Isabel was talking about earlier, that makes sense, or Elliot, that makes sense for a particular purpose, a particular policy that has a community, and then have that community perhaps work together on developing a regulatory framework that incorporates blockchain for that particular use case. So think of a regulation as another instance of a business network that would make sense for blockchain, just as a business transaction would. Yes?
Okay, good morning. My name is Roberto Fernandez from Everest Entity Data, and I have a question related to consortium. We are living the phenomenon of consortium in Spain, and Austria, in Latin America, like chain, and even in the European Commission association like INATBA. And my question is to know what is, from your point of view, the role of the public sector and government in this kind of association and consortium that they are pushing to create a national infrastructure and the synergies with the FC initiative. Thank you.
Well, it's about creating an ecosystem. Within the Netherlands, we aren't pushing to create a national infrastructure. So we are trying to cooperate within Europe, and the key is interoperability. So yeah, the key is interoperability. That's it.
Well, I would say that public administration always also learn from industry. So it's a very good thing that industry moves in that direction. So administration look very carefully and see that with very interest in order to get best practice and ideas to put in our administrations.
And my one comment on that is pretty short and sweet, which is the public sector government is positioned perfectly to be a huge, huge game changer and innovator in the identity space. You mentioned Austria, and they're focused on identity. Government has essentially all the power to move digital identity along, and identity is key to blockchain, and I think it's key to much, much more than just that.
I agree with
you. Thank you, Chairman. My name is Benjamin Bodo from Ghana, member of Ghana's Parliament. I want to find out from countries that are already implementing some aspects of this blockchain, what's the central government's commitment financially towards the adoption and implementation? If you can share your experiences with that.
Well, as I said before, we are looking for the use case that fits in that technology. Just waiting. It's difficult, it's very emerging, so we have to be very careful with that. That's why maybe we are starting in the way you are asking.
Well, we are also within the Netherlands investing in innovation, so not real applications. We're not still. Well, SSI is one of the applications we're investing a lot in, together with the European Commission. So there's some investment, but it's not enough. But I don't think it's only a matter of money, but it's also investing in, like I said before, cooperation. So you cannot implement only within the government. You need cross-sectoral cooperation.
And one of the things we're seeing in the U.S. is development of capacity building among government and industry working together. We're seeing communities of practice that are being sponsored by central government organizations, and experimentation on different developments of different blockchains within the government at the federal and state level. So rather than sort of yet be at a point of understanding, here's the blockchain budget per se, it's let's get together a set of use cases, invest in those use cases, and then build from there in a more agile fashion. I think we have time for one more. Yep.
Good morning. Jesus Cepeda from OECD, a GovTech company in Latin America. My question is, do you think the more use cases or the more experimentation you get, it gets easier to keep on pushing? Like, for example, when you think about tracing medicines or fake medicines, as the example they were giving on Mongolia, maybe it's the same as in Italy to trace fake credentials. But do you think it's easier to get into more government agencies or government process to implement blockchain? Do you think it's already a repeatable process to implement blockchain projects inside the public sector? Or is it a very specific case-by-case kind of thing still?
I think that it is certainly easier to implement the same use case across governments. I think it is also easier once you have blockchain in your government to use it for other things. All innovation, all developments, all lessons learned, to what Dan said earlier, help us do our job better, help us build technology faster and better. And so you take advantage of that, certainly, as an institution and globally as the public sector. As you see all of the conversation about supply chain solutions, they are technologically actually pretty easy to build. There are a lot of applications that are technologically easy to build. And so you'll certainly start to see that manifest. But again, technology is only one of kind of the three pillars.
Well, it's like you said, Isabel, from a technology point of view, it doesn't make sense to have more like supply chain use cases or pilots. But from a network point of view, like supply chain within the shipping industry, or having a pilot for supply chain within the aviation industry, these are completely other networks. So it does make sense to have more pilots or projects, but it has to be in another ecosystem in order to have added value.
Well, what I see that blockchain in the public administration could be a solution in cross-border context or inter-administrative context, you know, when you have many different actors or machines in the Internet of Things writing in the same blockchain. But again, then it's difficult to find a solution in that context because you have to reach agreements with others, and that's something outside the network. That's something about people. That's the main barrier I see in this moment, not technology, but agreements.
I think one of the great things about this conference and this session is that OECD can bring together use cases so that countries and companies can learn from one another to develop that experience repository. So, and as we close, if I could just ask you to take us to the future. If you think about sort of blockchain in government 5-10 years from now, one or two thoughts on what we'll see.
Well, my personal view is the invisible government. You won't see a civil servant. You'll just have to deal with your computer or handheld device, and don't know even if the government exists.
There's a provocative thought for lunch. Angel?
Yeah, I think in the future there will be some collaborative projects, again, between countries or different administrative levels. But blockchain will not be the recipe for everything. There is a great potential, for instance, combining blockchain with other emerging technologies such as Internet of Things. So will be many different actors and devices writing in blockchain, for instance, in food chain control, agriculture, transport, energy, and so on. That's my vision.
I appreciate the futurist perspective there for sure. I think that what we'll see in the future is a few things. Number one, to what Elliott just pointed out, our interaction with government will be very different. And when I say our, I mean citizens. Whether that is getting your driver's license or filing for a birth certificate, a death certificate, what have you, all of those things will be smoother. We will also see more effective market oversight. So on our platform, Corda, we have regulator nodes. Those regulators are there on the network observing, and they have the information that they have a need and a right to see go directly to them. So that means that when you combine blockchain and that observer element with other technologies like AI, you can start to more accurately see what's happening in the markets, predict what may be happening, use all the information, all the data at your fingertips so that we can avoid flash crashes, we can avoid lending crises. You can always have a clear picture of who holds which positions and where risk and credit is allocated. And then, of course, fast forward, we will move to the invisible government.
So our center wrote a book last year called Government for the Future, and we took a look at scenarios for different technology. We didn't talk about blockchain per se, but we talked about the technology suite, blockchain, AI, IoT. We thought about quantum, and I think two things. One, it enables government to provide better services for citizens because they can take advantage of the platforms. It enables citizen self-service or business self-service in working with governments. It also, I think, to close, augments human decision-making. So rather than perhaps the invisible government, maybe it is finally the smarter government, the ability of government to work with this technology to understand, to analyze, to provide better services, to make government employees' jobs richer and better as they serve citizens. So what a terrific discussion. Please join me in thanking our panel.